I'm here to talk about my trombone concerto. And there are a lot of questions that arise, like why is it a trombone concerto? How did it come about? And it's simplest if I tell you how the work came into being. It'll answer a lot of those questions. It is to do with this trombonist, Mick Mulcahy. He's a Sydney musician. He grew up in Sydney, was born here. In the late 80s, he moved to Melbourne. He became the principal trombone of the Melbourne Symphony. He then spent some time in Europe and finally was appointed to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. But when I got a call one day from Mick Mulcahy, the trombonist, out of the blue, and he said, "Hi Carl, this is Mick Mulcahy. Will you write a concerto for me and the Chicago Symphony?" I fell over a bit. And then when I stood up, I said, yes, that would be terrific. And indeed, it would be one of the great achievements of any composer's life to work with that orchestra. Now, oddly enough, when I'm about the same age as Mick, I think I'm probably a couple of years older, but when we were together, we were in Sydney at about the same time in the 1970s and 80s. We never actually met. I knew about him, and we had many friends in common, and I tried to work with him on a number of occasions because he is the most incredible trombonist, really a remarkable player. But we don't think we ever met at that time. So to get a call some 30 years later out of the blue was extraordinary. And what had happened to Mick, when he joined the Chicago Symphony in about 1989, he played with the symphony for many years and is still playing with them today. And around about 1995, 96, the chief conductor was Daniel Barenboim, and in fact, Mick played the concerto, the very first concerto for trombone that Kirill mentioned earlier, which is the Leopold Mozart concerto for alto trombone, and he played it with the Chicago Symphony. And Barenboim was so overcome with the beauty of his playing, he said to Mick, "You can commission any composer in the world, anyone you like, to write you a concerto." And Mick thought about this, and he thought about it some more, and he didn't want to make the wrong move, and he thought about it some more, and all of a sudden 15 years had passed by. And he hadn't made up his mind. And fortunately, I think the music director of the Chicago Symphony changed twice in that time. But the head of artistic programming had stayed the same, and she said to him, "It's okay, Mick, take your time, take your time." But at some point he realized he would have to make up his mind. And he did show me his shortlist. He had a shortlist of 20 people. Remember, any composer in the world. And somewhere near the top of the list there were 4 Australians. And I was one of those, and it was really only because he had just recorded a trombone solo that I wrote, in fact, back in the 1980s, called Love Song for trombone and pre-recorded tape. And he just recorded that, and he thought, that has some of the most beautiful melodies I've ever played, I'll ask Carl. And so that's how the whole thing came about. And so finally he had his decision, and that I decided then that I would write a work called 5 Songs for trombone and orchestra. Because he particularly wanted it to be lyrical, he said, "Look, I'm not a contemporary player. I don't like fast, leaping stuff all over the place and hard technical issues without any purpose." And so I thought 5 songs would be a lovely way to do this. At the same time, Mick said that he wanted it to have some sort of literary basis. And this is very important in terms of the structure of the work and the music in it and everything about it. And at about that time, I was reading a book by Oliver Sacks called Hallucinations. Have any of you read that book? Have any of you heard of the book? Sorry, none. One. Shocking. Okay, it's a fantastic book, so you really must read it. And what it deals with, Oliver Sacks, if you don't know, he was many things, but principally a neurologist. And he approached people and he never regarded it as mental disease. He regarded it as different ways of viewing reality. And so this book, Hallucinations, a hallucination is when you see something, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can smell it, you can say, that is absolutely real, but you actually know there's no way it can be real. I could be seeing a dragon right there, and I can see it, I can smell it, I can feel the heat of it. Its breath is awful, but I know that it's a hallucination. And that is what makes hallucinations. And in fact, the only thing that gives us reality is our perception. And the funny thing is that our perceptions can change. You can be fooled by optical illusions, and they can be a hallucination. But more frequently, and most of us have experienced this, if you wake up suddenly in the middle of the night and you think someone's calling your name, has anyone had that experience? Yeah, there we are. There's a bunch. Good. Well, that's a hallucination. Unless your mother's really angry at you and she is calling your name. But the other thing is, when you're falling asleep, you might think you hear something scraping at a window, you think, I can see a monster out there. All of these are hallucinatory states. And so this book, Hallucinations, looks at Oliver's clinical life, and he saw hundreds and hundreds of crazy people in his life. Except he never regarded them as crazy. He just regarded them as having different views of reality. And he categorized all of these different hallucinations into different types, so whether they are heard, seen, smelt, or felt. So you can feel things, or a combination of all those, and indeed particular mental conditions, whether it's brain damage of some sort, certain diseases, and they lead to very specific kinds of hallucinations. So I was fascinated by all of this, and I decided that I'd call it 5 Hallucinations. So rather than 5 songs, I quite like the idea of taking 5 of these hallucinations. And reading through the book, I read it twice in close succession. I made a note of all of the hallucinations that I thought were most interesting musically, and I had a list of about 30 of them, and some of them are absolutely extraordinary. But out of those 20 or 30, I picked 5 of them. And the first one is I Smell the Unicorn, which is a lovely idea that you can smell a unicorn. Paradoxically, it is a hallucination that is neither about smell nor about unicorns. Can you think of what it might have been? Anyone? No idea? Because none of you read the book, that's the problem. It is actually one of those acoustic hallucinations. So it is hearing the sentence, I smell the unicorn, just as you're going to sleep. And this is a woman, one of his patients, who had a number of these types of hallucinations. And this one, she's about to go to sleep, and she just hears this sentence, I smell the unicorn, over and over again. And she can't escape it. She knows it's a hallucination. She knows it's not her mother being angry with her. It's nothing else. It's just a hallucination. And the sentence has no personal meaning. She has no particular feeling for unicorns. She doesn't have an enhanced sense of smell. It's just the sentence, but it is unavoidable. So it was the idea in this particular movement to set up the whole hallucinatory experience and talk about what is reality, what can we perceive, what does that mean musically. Are there any questions so far?
How did that then play out musically? Do you mind telling us?
Well, we're going to see if there's enough time, I hope. So I will actually play it and we'll have a look at the orchestration. So the other thing I wanted to do in this work, and it's quite different from the Rachmaninoff and certainly classical and romantic concertos, I don't have set themes. So normally, if you have 5 movements, you'll have 5 different themes and each of them plays out through the movement and then you'll have a counter subject or whatever. That is not the case in this work, and there tends to be a family of motifs, of little melodic fragments that join together and move apart. And some of those move from movement to movement across the hallucinations. The thing that is in common across all 5 movements is the use of modal clusters, and we'll have a look at those in a little while. So just very quickly, the other movements, the Lemonade Speaks, which is both hilarious and terrifying. because this is a complete perceptual hallucination, and it's very common in people with quite severe schizophrenia, and that inanimate objects speak to you. They talk to you, you hear voices, and on the one hand, you can look at a bottle of lemonade and it suddenly starts speaking to you. And you think, well, that's bizarre, the lemonade is speaking to me. But then you think, my God, this is horrific. I'm being spoken to by lemonade, what is wrong with me? And that's a very common thing in hallucinations. So the second movement starts out quite friendly and bubbly. It's an effervescent lemonade, but then it actually becomes quite threatening, because lemonade ought not have the power of speech. The third one, Mama wants some cookies. Perfectly reasonable statement. Now this, in fact, is another one of those oral hallucinations, and it's, in fact, the same woman as before, and she hears over and over again the phrase, Mama wants some cookies. Once again, hilarious, not to do with Mama or with cookies, but it is an unavoidable experience that she hears over and over again, and that phrase, Mama wants some cookies, Mama wants some cookies, Mama wants some cookies, eventually becomes this sort of mantra that drives you mad. Mama wants some cookies. The other thing to bear in mind by this point, that the trombonist, as the soloist in this concerto, he's actually experiencing all these hallucinations. So Michael Mulcahy, who is in fact the most stable and normal person you can imagine, is in fact a complete psycho by the time we get to the Doppelganger. And the Doppelganger, has anybody had the feeling you're walking along the street and you think, someone's following me? Has anyone had that experience? Few couple? Yeah, there we go. Yes. It's a very common experience. Now, the Doppelganger is a very special version of that, where you think you're being followed by yourself. And if you think about that, that's also pretty spooky. So the sense of being followed, very common. It's a hallucination or a misimpression, but the sense of being followed by yourself is really quite bizarre, and normally the result of particular brain damage or certain neural diseases. And in that movement, whatever the trombonist, whatever the soloist plays, is picked up by the orchestra and thrown back at him. And he tries to do more and more extreme things, which the entire orchestra eventually laughs back at him. And the final movement then is hexagons in pink. And this, surprisingly, is quite common in a number of conditions, but particularly with the use of psychotropic drugs. And Oliver Sacks himself experimented with psychotropic drugs. He wanted to see what are the limits of my perception. And with certain drugs, this repetitive, animated, geometric shapes is an incredibly common experience. And so this was a musical representation of that particular hallucination. Any questions about that? So that is the shape of the entire piece at the moment, all 5 movements. The first one, we'll have a look at the score at the moment and hear some of it. I smell the unicorn. One of his patients frequently hears complete sentences spoken outside herself while drifting off to sleep. The phrases have no special personal meaning and bear witness to the extraordinary and unexpected creative power of the brain as it freewheels into sleep. Now that's the beginning of the score. And this is a special version I've done of the score so that we'll kind of squeeze into the screen a little bit. So this isn't a standard orchestral score. You can tell me instruments at the top of the score are what? Flute, except that is... I can't actually read that. What does it say? W, woodwind, mixed woodwind. So yes, it starts, I like to put piccolo at the top, although frequently the piccolo is played by the 3rd or 4th flute, and then it actually isn't at the top. But I like to have a single piccolo player, followed by the oboes normally, and the cor anglais, clarinets, bassoons, horns, trumpets, bass drum, tam-tam, harp, and the strings down the bottom. Can anyone tell me where the soloist would sit in that? No one. You call yourself year 11. No, you're not. Year 12. Year 10. Wow, okay. In that case, I'll tell you, the soloist will appear there, always just above the strings. And so if you have 3 soloists, they'll all appear just above the strings. So you're off the hook. But you'll notice that there are these sort of sliding figures, first in the bassoons, cellos, basses, taken up by the violas, and it's moving through the orchestra, getting higher and higher, and the violins, up with the upper woodwinds, and then back down again to the next page. Oops, there we are. Down again, taken up by the brass, and finishing up on this low note here. And there's our soloist, the solo trombone, and he plays that note. Do we have any trombonists here? Wow, that's great. What an unusually large number of trombonists. Terrific. Well, in that case, you can tell me what's odd about that note on the tenor trombone. It's the what? Pedal. Well, but what sort of pedal is it? Is it G? You call yourselves trombonists. It's the lowest note you can play as a pedal note on the tenor trombone. Because if you go any lower than that, that's in 7th position. If you go to 8th position, the slide falls off. Okay? And it's a funny thing because at the upper octave, when you normally play, when it isn't a pedal note, you can go down much further, but because it's that much longer tube down the end, you can only go down to the G. Up an octave, you can go down to the E, yeah? So the idea was to start with the very lowest note on the trombone. Now, on this particular recording, it isn't very powerful note, but when it does come through on a real recording, it should penetrate quite well. And then we have a little solo for the trombone that goes on. We have these little interjections from the winds there, a little bit of support from the horns. And that's kind of the setup to say, all right, this is throwing you into a hallucinatory state. And so this is the beginning of the work that hopefully sets up the rest of the piece as being something extraordinary. So tuba takes over. Okay? So I don't know how it sounds out there. It sounds rather gutless down here. But with the full orchestra in a decent acoustic, it should give you a great sense of having been, or starting, a pretty extraordinary journey. Are there any questions about that score, the orchestration?
Carl, is that theme that you wrote for the trombone at the beginning, is that developed?
It returns. The tritone theme sort of comes back. It's a kind of cellular approach to melodic development. But this theme as such does not recur. As I say, it repeats once to say, remember this bit. And between each of the 5 hallucinations, there's normally a little passage of, like an interstitial passage that just takes you back into the hallucinatory state before the next one begins. Yes, there is no break. Yeah, so it just drags you all the way through. But yeah, so as I mentioned at the outset, there aren't set themes as such, and they don't sort of develop in the normal sense. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is Michael Mulcahy going to come out and play?
He is, indeed, yeah. And the other thing I forgot to mention is that although the original commission was for Chicago, they're very happy to make it a dual commission with the Sydney Symphony. So it's being played in April, the beginning of April next year for the Meet the Music and TN Symphony, and that'll be with Michael Mulcahy, the soloist, and Mark Wigglesworth, conductor. Any other questions? No? The other thing to note about the the approach to orchestration, the relationship of the soloist, as Kirill mentioned, with trombone you have enormous latitude because apart from these incredibly low notes, which actually don't penetrate very well, when the trombone gets up to its normal register around here, then at that point he can actually drown out pretty much all the orchestra except for the brass. So even if you have all the strings going, a lot of the winds going, a few horns, you will still hear the soloist, and that's not true of pretty much any other solo instrument in a concerto, maybe trumpet. I'll just let it play on a little bit more, and you'll hear the idea of this, getting used to the pointer. This idea here, this sort of running figure, which keeps going through, that's marimba there, horns, marimba, horns, and then taken up by the rest of the orchestra. This is the kind of hallucinatory haze that informs the entire first movement. So I'll just play on from where we stopped at the GP bar. Anyone tell me what GP stands for? General pause, which doesn't actually mean you pause, it just means no one's playing. Or general pausa, I think, but yeah. So you don't actually pause, you just shh for a bar. We'll go on. This is actually the sentence. I hear the unicorn. Sorry, I smell the unicorn. So there's a lot more of that, and indeed it goes on for another 18 or 20 minutes after that. I think we're going to have a Q&A now, because we're almost out of time. At the outset, are there any questions from the audience? Yes?
What were some of the other ideas you might have gone with when you were sort of shortlisted?
So you mean other than Hallucinations at all, or?
Other than the 5 you had.
Oh, the 5 I had. Wow, there were some terrific ones in there. There was a small red devil riding a bicycle. Golly, I can actually, because as you can figure, I love all this. I've got them all here somewhere. There we are. Little Men and Women in Medieval Attire. The Endless God Bless America. That was almost one of them. A very faint black and white Mickey Mouse. Hippopotamuses sitting on one side of a pillow. Small black parrots gradually vanishing among mountain snows. And 2 rats eating a potato. So as I said, there's about 20 or 30 of those, and I think they're terrific. It just goes to show you, and these aren't, normal, these aren't sort of abnormally creative people. These are just normal people who get these extraordinary visions. It tells you about the power in everyone's mind to invent quite extraordinary things out of nothing, including all of you. You're all nuts. Or as Oliver Sacks said, none of you are. Questions? Yes?
You mentioned modal clusters. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Modal clusters. Yep. You will notice they're actually everywhere, but most particularly this sort of thing here. So those are the trombones there. Now that's a little bit more chromatic, but certainly clusters. These here are clusters. That functions as a modal cluster, because although it's separate notes, you hear them as a kind of continuous thing, because that's marimba with a very soft beta. And that sort of configuration does happen throughout the work, sometimes more obviously than others. So this is all the sort of swirling hallucinatory stuff, but then we get into, well, that's more of it, here we are. Anyway, trust me, there's an awful lot of it. That's in the horns there, all those clusters. Those are not chromatic, because they're all kind of on a set scale, and so they're modal clusters. Got a question up the back? Yes?
How did you get to know about all the instruments so that you could write a concerto?
I'm very, very old. And the first thing is that you need to do a lot of study. The second thing is to, and I was also a professional musician for a very long time, and so I actually had an ensemble with a trombonist for 10 years and played with flute players and violinists and everything. So working as a professional musician is the best way. The next best way is to go to university and you study all this stuff. If you go to Sydney University, you'll get me in first year teaching you orchestration. And we go through every instrument and their range and what they are best at playing, what they are worst at playing, how to write for them, how to set out scores, all of that sort of stuff. But I actually learned it just from being on the job, also from composing. My earliest scores are no longer available because they're really awful. But that is how I learnt how to do it, and I would have musicians laughing at me a lot, saying, you can't write that for flute, you can't write that for oboe. And I would learn how to do it, and next time I would not make those mistakes again. So, yeah, these days, just go to university, a conservatorium. Yes?
So you talked about the literary influences in this piece. Were there any particular musical influences that you used?
So the question was, it was a literary input for this 5 hallucinations. There wasn't any specific musical thought, except that having made the decision to talk about hallucinations, then I had to find a musical language that was hallucinatory for me. The other interesting thing that I didn't really touch on is that I'm sure that Mick Mulcahy, when he asked me for a literary thing, he was thinking of 5 nice little poems. And he wasn't really thinking about going into this whole hallucinatory thing and, illicit drugs and so on. And it actually took a while to convince him that it was a good idea. But otherwise, it was absolutely his concerto, and he had to then feel confident about the hallucinations to go forward. But no, there's nothing musical. The only thing is each one of the 5 has quite a different character, both rhythmically and harmonically, and also in the treatment of the orchestra. So number 4, for instance, just starts with this slow trill chord and the trombone over the top of it. They all have a very different approach to how the soloist sits over the orchestra.
Carl, did you work extended techniques?
Mick said no extended techniques, which suits me fine. However, I reckon in my book that opening note is a pretty much extended technique. And it comes back, I'm not sure if it's here. Where are we at the end? Anyway, there are a few little bits and pieces, also some massive jumps. So at one point he leaps pretty much the entire range of the instrument from a low B-flat pedal to a high B-flat, which is 1, 2, 3 octaves. And that 3-octave leap is about the nastiest thing you can do to a trombonist. Am I wrong? Because I'm not wrong. Because your embouchure, when you play a low note, is very loose. And when you play a high note, it has to be tight, but not too tight, or you'll damage your lips. So it's a very nasty thing. But Mick quite enjoyed the fact that he was able to do it. And
Mutes or anything like that?
no mutes, no. And that seemed quite appropriate. And of course, it's all about tone control. And particularly, there were some quite romantic melodies, and so it's about the romance of those melodies. Is that another question? Yeah.
Yeah. How much input did Mick have in the compositional process?
Michael? Yeah, Michael had more input than I've ever allowed a soloist. And frequently, because I've now written, I think, 11 concertos, it's the only time that the soloist has really said, I don't want to do that, I want to do something else. And so it was quite confronting for me. Fortunately, Mick was so completely dedicated to the idea of the concerto and getting it right. He spotted a lot of, I was going to say errors in the score. I don't write errors, I make little mistakes. But he fixed a lot of those, and he had some really good ideas about how to change the balance, and particularly things like those octave leaps. I said, do you really want to do this? And he said, yeah, I can do that, but I don't want to do that. But also, as you'll know, there's a lot of stuff you can do on the trombone that's incredibly awkward, and it doesn't sound awkward, it sounds quite simple. And that's really annoying when you're slaving very hard to do something that sounds simple. Contrarily, there's some stuff you can do very easily that sounds virtuosic. And so that's what I was aiming for, and Mick was terrific to give me some of that, which you'll notice if you look at the score, that is not so hard but sounds much harder than it is. The question is, composing, how do you go about it, I guess? And sometimes I will have an idea for a texture. In fact, that's the way, particularly with orchestral music, I'll start with a texture and then wonder how I can fill that out. And then I'll think, all right, well, it needs to have something melodic over there. What does the melody need to do? What does that imply in terms of the harmonic context? What pitches occur with it? So it can be a number of things, and it's rarely the same thing twice in the same work. And so it's not simply a question of coming up with a bunch of chords and then putting a melody on the top, or vice versa, of having a melodic idea. For me, it's a combination of elements, and any one can take precedence, and then you have to fill in the gaps. But particularly in a work of 20 minutes duration, you need to have a lot of different ways of approaching your material. The important thing for those of you who are interested in composing is you need technique. So you need to discover a whole bunch of different ways to order your material and to make it into viable music.
Sorry, how exactly did you represent the sensation of having a hallucination in these pieces?
Well, that's an excellent question. The idea at the outset was to have that kind of waving, hazy sound to say, all right, you are hallucinating now. The rest of it was to be incredibly literal about what the hallucinations are. So the one, Mama Wants Some Cookies, when the trombonist starts playing, it just starts with this sort of plodding rhythm, and the trombonist starts playing, ba-ba, 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 Mama wants some cookies, Mama wants some cookies, Mama wants some cookies, and so on. And then bit by bit, the orchestra all take up that phrase. So there's nothing about that intrinsically that says this is a hallucination, but it is a musical representation of what the hallucination would mean to me. The Doppelganger, as I mentioned, starts with the trombonist just playing a little melody that then the horns just echo it. Then he tries another melody, and then the woodwinds echo that. He tries something else. The brass echo that, and everything he does is echoed by the orchestra until he can't escape. And as Mick says, he's actually killed by the orchestra at the end. So it's really being, because they're quite ephemeral things, hallucinations, being incredibly literal about what each hallucination is. Does that help? Yeah. Thank you.